At the turn of the 20th century, a once independent Korea found itself caught between great powers with ambitions in East Asia. Over a few decades, the neighboring empire of Japan systematically reduced Korea's sovereignty until in 1910, Korea was formally annexed. This changed the lives of millions, reshaped Korea's future for decades, and left scars that are still felt today. In this video, we will explore how Japan colonized Korea. We will show you the step-by-step of treaties, wars, pressures, and political maneuvers that stripped Korea of its freedom, and the impact of that dark period. Chapter 1. Background Korea in a Changing Asia. For centuries, Korea had stood strong as an independent kingdom, managing its own affairs under the leadership of its monarchy. The kingdom of Joseon, which had ruled Korea for over 500 years, maintained its sovereignty and operated in relative peace. However, by the late 1800s, the world around Korea was rapidly changing. The region was becoming a battleground for imperial powers, namely China, Russia, and Japan, who sought to assert control over Korea for its strategic location and resources. According to the Korea Society, Korea was seen not just as a nation, but as a prize to be claimed in the broader competition for influence in East Asia. At the same time, Japan was undergoing a dramatic transformation. After centuries of isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan opened its doors to the outside world with the arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. The end of Japan's isolation led to the Meiji Restoration, a period of rapid modernization where Japan adopted Western-style institutions and technologies. Japan quickly built a powerful army and navy, transitioning from a feudal society to a modern industrial nation. As E.B.S. Kyo explains, this newfound strength and ambition spurred Japan to look outward, with Korea becoming an attractive target for political and economic influence. Korea, on the other hand, was weak and vulnerable. Although it had some diplomatic ties to China, its internal struggles, including widespread corruption and limited resources, made it less capable of defending its sovereignty. At this time, China was also in decline, weakened by internal strife and foreign pressures. As a result, Korea became caught between these imperial powers, unable to protect its independence. Japan, seeing an opportunity, set its sights on Korea. As Open Edition Books points out, Korea's location, rich resources, and proximity to Japan made it an ideal target for expansion. Japan's imperial ambitions grew, fueled by the desire for power, prestige, and resources. It sought to emulate the Western empires, which had been carving out colonies around the globe. With Korea's vulnerability and proximity, Japan saw it as the perfect place to extend its reach and secure its future as a dominant power in Asia. Chapter 2. The First Crack, 1876, and the Opening of Korea. Japan's first significant move toward influencing Korea came in 1876 with the signing of the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876, a critical turning point in Korea's history. The treaty was the result of Japan's gunboat diplomacy, where Japan used its military might to pressure Korea into signing an agreement that would favor Japan's interests. According to Wikipedia, Japan's naval power played a crucial role in forcing Korea to accept this deeply unequal treaty, which marked the beginning of Korea's gradual loss of autonomy. Under the terms of the treaty, Korea was forced to renounce its status as a tributary state to China, effectively ending China's influence over Korea. This was a significant blow to Korea's traditional ties with China, which had long been its dominant political and cultural partner. The treaty also opened several Korean ports to Japanese trade, allowing Japan to establish a foothold in Korea's economy. Additionally, Japanese merchants were granted extraterritorial rights, meaning they were not subject to Korean law but instead followed their own country's legal system. This provision further undermined Korea's sovereignty and control over its own territory. The treaty also allowed Japan to establish diplomatic relations with Korea and open Korean markets to Japanese goods, which flooded the market and began to dominate Korean commerce. As noted by Wikipedia, while Korea remained technically independent, the terms of the treaty significantly reduced its control over its own trade and economic affairs. The treaty shifted Korea from being a kingdom that maintained its own autonomy into a country increasingly influenced and controlled by Japan's economic and political interests. Although Korea wasn't yet fully annexed, this treaty marked the first crack in its sovereignty, and it set the stage for Japan's continued pressure. Over time, this treaty and the unequal relationships that followed would deepen the divide between Korea's internal governance and the growing external influence of Japan. This slow erosion of Korea's autonomy paved the way for more direct Japanese intervention in the years to come. Chapter 3. Rising Pressure, Early 1900s and Wars. The late 1800s and early 1900s were a period of intense rivalry in East Asia, particularly over Korea's future. Japan, Russia, and other powers, including China, all sought to extend their influence over the Korean Peninsula. As Asia for Educators explains, Korea's strategic position, resources, and potential as a buffer zone made it a key target for these imperial powers. In 1894, tensions in Korea led to the First Sino-Japanese War, a conflict that would fundamentally change the region's balance of power. Korea, struggling with internal rebellions and instability, had requested assistance from China. However, Japan, seeing this as an opportunity to weaken China's influence in Korea, declared war. The war, lasting until 1895, ended with Japan's decisive victory. As a result, China was forced to relinquish any claim over Korea, and Korea was formally recognized as an independent state in theory, but in practice it became more heavily influenced by Japan. The outcome of the war marked Japan as the dominant power in the region, and it solidified Japan's position as the primary external influence in Korean affairs, as Asia for Educators notes. After the war, Japan's influence over Korea only grew. Japan began to exert increasing pressure on Korea's political structure, exploiting its internal instability and weakening governance. As Japan's influence deepened, Korea found itself more and more vulnerable to political interference. Japanese diplomats and military advisors infiltrated Korean government circles, gradually gaining control over important decisions. In 1904, despite Korea's declaration of neutrality in the ongoing Russo-Japanese War, Japan began its military occupation of Korea. According to Wikipedia, Japanese troops entered Seoul, the capital of Korea, under the pretext of protecting Japanese interests in the region. This presence of Japanese forces in Korea was a clear demonstration of Japan's growing dominance. It was not long before Japan used this military presence to force Korea into signing the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1904. The treaty gave Japan effective control over Korea's foreign affairs, military, and diplomatic relations. Under this treaty, Japan gained the right to intervene in Korean affairs and began to dominate the country's diplomacy. The treaty marked a major step in Japan's efforts to strip Korea of its sovereignty, making Korea a de facto protectorate of Japan. Japan's increasing military presence and political interference only heightened the tensions, setting the stage for the eventual annexation of Korea in 1910. Chapter 4. Protectorate and Loss of Internal Control. Just as a house can be slowly taken over before full ownership, Japan pursued a gradual yet determined strategy to dominate Korea. The Japan-Korea Treaty of 1904 marked a pivotal moment in this slow takeover. Initially presented as a mutual agreement of friendship and protection, the treaty allowed Japan significant influence over Korean affairs. However, this protection was not in Korea's best interest, but served to strengthen Japan's political and economic control. As Wikipedia explains, the treaty granted Japan the right to intervene in Korean matters under the guise of safeguarding Korea's sovereignty, but in reality it set the stage for Japan's further domination. Over the following years, Japan tightened its grip on Korea, systematically stripping the Korean government of its power. In 1905, a new agreement transferred control of key services such as Korea's postal, telegraph, and telephone systems to Japan. These vital communication networks were now in Japanese hands, further reducing Korea's control over its own infrastructure. As noted by Wikipedia, these concessions were just the beginning. Japan continued to infiltrate the Korean state, manipulating both the economy and administration for its benefit. By 1907, Japan had all but taken over Korea's internal administration, with the signing of the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1907. This agreement removed Korea's ability to function independently. The Korean government lost its power to appoint officials, pass laws, and even control its own military. High-ranking positions were filled by Japanese appointees, turning Korean institutions into a mere extension of Japanese rule. As Wikipedia explains, Korea had become a protectorate in name only, with Japan now controlling nearly all aspects of governance. The final symbolic blow to Korea's sovereignty came when the Korean Emperor Gojong was forced to abdicate. This event marked the end of Korea's monarchy. The emperor was replaced by a figurehead who had no real authority. Under Japan's control, the Korean people's aspirations for self-rule were crushed. This period represented the near-complete loss of internal control, setting the stage for Japan's eventual full annexation of Korea in 1910. The Korean people had little choice but to accept their new reality under Japan's oppressive rule. Chapter 5. Annexation. The final blow in 1910. All the previous steps, the military presence, the unequal treaties, and the removal of internal control were merely preludes to the final act that would formally seal Korea's fate. On August 22, 1910, representatives from both Japan and Korea signed the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1910. This treaty marked the official annexation of Korea by Japan, with Korea surrendering all its sovereignty to its neighbor. According to Wikipedia, this treaty legally erased Korea's independence, bringing it under the direct control of the Japanese government. Under the terms of the treaty, the Korean Emperor Gojong was forced to concede all rights to the Korean Peninsula. Japan, in return, formally accepted the annexation. From that moment on, Japan took full administrative control of Korea. This effectively ended Korea's political and cultural autonomy, transforming the once independent kingdom into a colony of the Japanese Empire. As World JPN explains, the Japanese government now held complete power, overseeing everything from the economy to education. Japan immediately began restructuring Korean society to serve its imperial interests. The Korean government was dissolved, and political institutions were replaced with Japanese-appointed military governors and officials. Korean leaders who had opposed Japanese control were either exiled, imprisoned, or silenced. As Ace outlines, freedoms such as speech, assembly, and press were revoked. Korean voices of resistance were suppressed, and the country's political landscape was radically altered. One of the most profound changes came in education. Japanese was made the official language in schools, and the Japanese educational system was enforced. Korean language and history were no longer taught, and the rich cultural heritage of Korea was downplayed or erased. As Young Pioneer Tours explains, traditional Korean culture, customs, and even clothing were actively discouraged as Japan sought to assimilate Koreans into its imperial system. Korean identity and pride were systematically repressed. The annexation also had a severe impact on Korea's economy. The land and resources were reorganized to serve Japan's needs, with many Koreans losing their land to Japanese settlers and businesses. The forced exploitation of Korea's labor and resources benefited Japan's growing empire but left the Korean people impoverished and disenfranchised. For the average Korean, life under Japanese rule changed profoundly. The once thriving and independent kingdom was reduced to a mere colony, stripped of its sovereignty, culture, and self-determination. This period of annexation would last until the end of World War II, leaving scars that would shape Korea's identity for generations to come. Chapter 6. Occupation and Impact. Life under Japanese rule, 1910 to 1945. The period of Japanese colonial rule in Korea from 1910 to 1945 was marked by sweeping changes that touched every aspect of Korean life, from governance and education to the economy and society. Under the direct control of Japan, Korea was transformed into a colony that served Japan's strategic and economic needs, with little regard for the well-being of its people. One of the first changes introduced by the colonial government was the building of infrastructure. The Japanese constructed railways, roads, and administrative offices across the Korean Peninsula. These developments were primarily designed to serve Japan's imperial ambitions, allowing for easier transport of resources and military movements. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the colonial infrastructure was oriented toward enhancing Japan's economic interests rather than benefiting the Korean people, as it was primarily focused on exporting Korean resources back to Japan. In the field of education, the Japanese imposed a strict policy to suppress Korean language and culture. Korean schools were either closed or severely restricted, and the Japanese language became the mandatory medium of instruction. Encyclopedia Britannica points out that Japanese history and culture replaced Korean traditions in schools, aiming to erase Korean identity from the next generation. Furthermore, many Koreans were barred from public service or higher-level jobs unless they abandoned their Korean identity and accepted Japanese rule. This policy was designed to ensure that the Korean population remained subordinate to their Japanese rulers, with very few opportunities for upward mobility unless they conformed to the colonial system. Cultural suppression was pervasive, and the Japanese administration sought to eliminate any remnants of Korean identity. Traditional customs, language, and even Korean names were discouraged. In some cases, Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese-style family names. As Young Pioneer Tours explains, this was part of a broader effort to erase Korea's cultural heritage and replace it with Japanese customs, aiming to fully assimilate the population into the empire. Koreans who resisted these cultural changes faced social and political punishment. Economically, Japan exploited Korea for its resources, labor, and agricultural output. The land was seized, and many Koreans lost their property to Japanese settlers and businesses. The Korean workforce was conscripted into low-wage labor, working in mines, factories, and fields under harsh conditions. Some Koreans were even forcibly drafted into Japan's military or sent to work in Japanese factories as part of the war effort. As Young Pioneer Tours notes, many Koreans saw their lives reduced to grueling labor, with little to no compensation, while Japan reaped the benefits of Korea's resources. Despite the repression, Korean resistance to Japanese rule never disappeared. Nationalist sentiment simmered beneath the surface, and many Koreans continued to fight for their independence, both through passive resistance and more direct forms of activism. The injustices of colonial rule sparked the flames of nationalism, laying the foundation for future struggles for independence. Even under harsh conditions, many Koreans secretly preserved their culture, language, and traditions, passing them on to future generations. Though the years under Japanese rule were marked by suffering and exploitation, they also sowed the seeds for Korea's eventual liberation. The resilience of the Korean people and their desire for freedom would later inspire movements that led to Korea's independence after Japan's defeat in World War II. The scars of this period would remain, but so too would the unbreakable spirit of the Korean nation. Chapter 7. Why Japan did it. Motives behind the colonization. Why did Japan go to such lengths to take over Korea? Several factors played into Japan's decision to colonize the Korean Peninsula. These motivations can be grouped into strategic, economic, imperial, and political reasons, each of which contributed to Japan's drive for expansion in the early 20th century. First, strategic location. Korea's geographical position made it a key prize for any imperial power. Sitting between Japan and the Asian mainland, Korea became a critical strategic location. By controlling Korea, Japan could establish a foothold on the continent, acting as a buffer zone between Japan and potential threats from China and Russia. As museum.seoul.go.kr explains, Korea provided Japan with the opportunity to project power into East Asia and safeguard its own interests from the growing influence of other nations. It was an essential gateway that would provide Japan with security in a region of competing powers. Second, economic resources. As Japan industrialized and grew into a modern empire, it needed resources to fuel its rapid economic expansion. Korea, with its fertile farmland, valuable natural resources, and a sizable population, offered an abundance of opportunities. Open edition books highlights that Korea's agricultural and mineral wealth was seen as a vital asset to Japan's burgeoning industries. By colonizing Korea, Japan was able to tap into these resources, using them to support its growing economy and military apparatus. Korea also offered cheap labor, which Japan could exploit to further strengthen its industrial base. Third, imperial ambition and competition. Japan's desire to assert itself as a modern imperial power was driven by its desire to compete with the Western colonial empires that had been expanding across the globe. As Asia for Educators notes, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European and American powers were aggressively carving out colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Japan, having emerged from isolation and undergone rapid modernization, sought to prove itself as a world power by participating in this global competition for territory. Colonizing Korea was seen as a logical step in Japan's imperial ambitions, positioning itself as a major force in East Asia and beyond. Lastly, political and military leverage. Japan's military successes played a critical role in its ability to impose its will on Korea. Following Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, Japan gained considerable influence over Korea, weakening China's hold on the peninsula. However, it was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 that truly solidified Japan's dominance. Asia for Educators explains that Japan's victory over Russia, a major world power, demonstrated its military strength and gave it both diplomatic and military leverage to impose treaties on Korea. With its newfound military power, Japan was able to force Korea into agreements that would ultimately lead to annexation. In conclusion, Japan's colonization of Korea was driven by a combination of strategic, economic, imperial, and political motivations. Korea's position as a vital link between Japan and the Asian mainland, its abundant resources, Japan's imperial ambitions, and the military leverage Japan gained through its victories all played crucial roles in shaping Japan's decision to annex Korea. These factors converged to create a situation where Korea's sovereignty was gradually eroded until it was formally absorbed into the Japanese Empire in 1910. Conclusion: the colonization of Korea by Japan was not a single isolated event. It was a gradual process that unfolded over several decades. Through a series of wars, unequal treaties, political manipulation, and military presence, Japan slowly stripped Korea of its autonomy, bit by bit. On August 22, 1910, the formal annexation of Korea by Japan marked the final end to centuries of Korean independence. For 35 long years, Korea lived under the harsh rule of Japan. The Korean people endured immense suffering, from the suppression of their culture and traditions to the widespread economic exploitation of their land and labor. Their freedoms were stripped away, and their voices silenced. The cultural and political reordering that took place under Japanese rule left a profound impact on Korean society, one that continues to influence Korea's identity and its relations with neighboring countries in East Asia today. Understanding this painful history is important, not just as a reminder of Korea's past, but also to recognize the resilience of its people. Despite the suppression they faced, the Korean spirit endured. The struggle for independence never vanished, and it was this spirit that ultimately led to Korea's liberation in 1945. This history also serves as a powerful reminder of the deep scars left by colonialism. It teaches us the vital importance of sovereignty, the preservation of culture, and the dignity of nations. As we reflect on this chapter of history, it is clear that the lessons learned from Korea's colonization should be remembered as we continue to value and respect the autonomy and heritage of all nations.